Should I introduce myself? I'm sorry. Should I say who I am or?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. So I'm Bryan Lowe. I teach Japanese religions in the Religious Studies department here at Vanderbilt. And I thought I would talk a little bit about kind of how I first got interested in Japan, and then a little bit about kind of how I think about my own position kind of in relationship to Japan, for a few minutes today. I first got interested in Japan when I was really small. I mean, I was probably 5 or 6 years old when the great cinematic masterpiece Karate Kid came out, and I loved it. I watched it and I wanted to do martial arts, so I started learning karate when I was a little kid, and it was an Okinawan style of karate, which is a set of islands off of south of Japan, now a part of Japan. And when we do martial arts, we'd count. We'd go ich, ni, san. It's been years, so I can't throw punches as well, but we could learn how to count to 10. And I got to high school. They offered Japanese in my high school. So I thought, hey, I can count to 10. How hard can this language be? And so I started taking Japanese when I was in high school. And it turns out Japanese is really, really hard, or at least it was really, really hard for me. And it also turns out that I'm really poor at learning languages. So when I went back to a high school reunion a few years ago, all of my classmates said, of all the people in our Japanese class, I can't believe you're the one that stuck with it. Because I was like the worst student. But I was stubborn and I stuck with it. When I was interested in Japan originally, I had kind of these, and I'm going to get back to this, I had these kind of exotic ideas about Japan, right? I saw Japan, my knowledge of Japan as a child was literally through the film Karate Kid 2 when he goes to Japan. That was kind of my image of Japan. Another thing that happened to me when I was in high school is I also got interested in Buddhism. And my interest in Buddhism was really initially stimulated kind of by a similar kind of exotic idea about what Buddhism was. I was reading novels of Jack Kerouac, poetry by Allen Ginsberg, these beat writers, and I got really interested in kind of their 1950s version of what Buddhism was. And I was inspired by that, and we had this speaker that was an alumni of my high school who's a relatively famous and somewhat controversial scholar of Buddhism, Robert Thurman, also Uma Thurman's father, and he gave a talk, and I remember thinking, I had to interview him for the school paper, and I remember thinking, like, this guy is like Master Yoda. He's got like all of this great wisdom from the East, and again, kind of my knowledge of Buddhism, my interest of Buddhism was very much through this kind of westernized perspective, was very kind of exotic notion of Buddhism. A lot of my early interest in Asia and in Asian religions in Japan kind of was this like exotic kind of mystical world that was very foreign to my own world. In high school, I had the opportunity to go to Japan and study abroad, and then in college, I studied abroad again, and I met the woman that became my wife. I graduated from college, I lived in Japan, I worked for the Japanese government in an office for a number of years, and I think one of the things I learned through that whole experience is kind of the opposite. Now when I think of Japan, when I was first asked to do this interview, I said, I don't really have anything interesting to say about Japan, because for me, Japan's just this really familiar place. And I've been going to Japan almost every year since I was in my early 20s. The first time I went to Japan I was 18. And then since my early 20s, I've been pretty much going to Japan every single year of my life, and sometimes living in Japan for multiple years at a time. And so now when I go back to Japan, what do I think about? I think about like getting French pastries and going out for Italian food, and then also going out for sushi, which is like the same things I do here in Nashville, right, in certain ways. Why I want to kind of stress that is I think one of the things I've learned as I've gotten much more familiar with another culture is that it's not some exotic place, that obviously there are, clear cultural differences and things like that, but for the most part in my day-to-day life isn't all that different when I'm in Japan than when I'm in the United States. One of the things that's important to learn as we think about other cultures is, while it's really important, I think, to respect cultural difference, to understand cultural difference, but to also, I think, recognize kind of similarities. And particularly kind of for modern industrialized worlds like Japan, it's not as kind of foreign and shocking of a place as I expected Japan to be. One of the things I've learned through spending lots of time in Japan is kind of recognizing commonalities and also recognizing how frequently our stereotypes fail. So the stereotypes I had about Japanese people before I went to Japan, none of them are true. Similarly, it's interesting, my father-in-law, I don't want to criticize my father-in-law, I respect him very much, but he hasn't spent much time in America, and even despite the fact that I'm at his house for 6 weeks every year, he still holds certain stereotypes about Americans that aren't true. So every year he's really concerned, like, that I'm not eating enough steak, because he thinks like if I don't eat steak every day, like I will not survive. Like Americans must eat beef like at least 5 times a week, or but I hardly ever eat beef when I'm in America. I like the occasional steak, but he has this idea that like I must be eating steak. I think so many of these stereotypes that we have about each other are false. And kind of recognizing commonalities is really, really important. And I'd say that's one of the lessons that I've learned in kind of my 20 years of experience going to Japan, and even longer experience with studying Japanese language and things of that nature.
That was awesome.
Was that okay?